They came for him like coyotes in the dark, snarling, circling, certain he'd fold like most boys do when hell rides in. But they didn't know the fire that shaped him. They didn't know who forged his silence. Before this day ends, the dirt will remember their names, and why it had to bury them. Ashridge sat like a brittle bone in the mouth of the desert, sun-cracked and forgotten. It had 2 streets, one crooked steeple, and a lonesome bell that hadn't rung in months. Wind dragged dust through the alleys, like old ghosts, whispering stories no one wanted to hear. Storefronts peeled under the sun's glare, and even the horses seemed to squint. The town had no sheriff until one day it did, and most folks still weren't sure what to make of that. Elias Kane came out of nowhere, just after the spring flood. He drifted into town soaked to the ribs, carrying a broken rifle and a sealed letter in his boot. Barely 20 by the look of him, thin as fence wire and quiet as winter. He took the badge no one else wanted and pinned it to his chest with a hand that didn't tremble. People expected he'd leave by morning. He didn't. He kept to himself, lived above the livery in a room with no curtains, didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't curse. That made folks uneasy. A man that still and that young had to be hiding something. At the Dry Mare Saloon, old men wagered on how long he'd last. Too soft, they'd say, watching him walk by like a shadow, spine straight, hat low, eyes never wandering. He don't got the iron. They called him the ghost sheriff, the mute boy, a badge without a bite. He'd walk the town every day, dawn to dusk, never armed unless you counted the pocket knife clipped to his belt. He nodded at the widows, helped old man Hensley carry feed sacks on Fridays, and read to the banker's blind daughter on Sundays. Always quiet, always present, never smiling. Yet when old Josie Harper's boy vanished in the hills, Elias was the one who brought him back. No posse, no questions. Just showed up 3 days later with the kid asleep in his arms and a wolf bite on his leg. Wouldn't speak a word about what happened. Just stitched himself up and went back to work. That was the first time the townsfolk wondered if maybe there was something under all that stillness. "I seen a thing once," said Boone Raddock, leaning against the hitching post with a chew in his cheek and too many winters in his eyes. 10 years back. Dust storm rolling over Devil's Gash. Thought the world was ending. Out of that mess comes one rider, slick with blood and riding a black mare that foamed at the mouth. They say that rider killed 15 men that day and vanished into the canyons. No name, no grave, just gone. "Why you bringing up that old ghost story again, Boone?" asked the bartender, polishing a cracked glass with a rag that had long since given up. Boone spat. "Because that rider wore the same kind of boots, same damn stitching, same silver buckle." He tipped his hat toward the sheriff's office. Same eyes. No one believed Boone, not really. But after that, they stopped mocking Elias where he could hear. It was high noon and hot enough to blister bone when the riders came. 6 of them, dust-caked, black-clad, and grinning like the devil owed them a favor. Their horses were lean and mean-eyed, flanks heaving, mouths lathered with foam. Lead horseman wore a blood-red scarf, and a wide brim hat shadowing a face cut from leather and war. His name wasn't spoken yet, but the silence that followed him through town spoke loud enough. They didn't slow. Rode straight down Main Street, boots dragging, guns loose in their holsters, eyes sweeping every porch and shuttered window. Mothers pulled children close. Men turned away, spines stiff with a coward's dignity. The sheriff stepped out of his office, no hat, just a book in one hand and dust on his boots. He didn't reach for a gun, just watched them ride by like he was studying the wind. The one with the red scarf turned in the saddle, eyes locking on Elias, like a hunter noticing movement in the brush. He smiled without warmth. "Well now," he drawled, voice coarse and full of smoke. "A pup with a star. Ain't that something that—" Elias didn't respond. One of the riders laughed. Another spat near the sheriff's boots. Elias flipped the book shut. His eyes moved from man to man, like marking graves before the dirt was even turned. Then he turned and walked back inside without a word. That evening, the saloon filled with whispers. Folks guessed who the riders were, what they wanted, how much blood would stain the streets come morning. Some packed bags. Others cleaned rifles. Boone sat near the hearth with his hat in his lap. "Those ain't just drifters," he muttered. "That's Clay Marlowe and the Vultures." No one breathed. They hit Hollow Creek last winter. Burned it down to ash. Sheriff there tried to stand him off. They hung him upside down from the church bell. The room grew colder despite the heat. Someone asked what they were doing here. Boone looked at the door. Looking for a challenge, maybe. Or maybe they heard about the boy with the badge. Across town, Elias sat alone in his office. On his desk lay the sealed letter he'd carried in his boot all those years ago. The edges were worn soft, the wax faded but unbroken. Beside it, a small leather pouch. He reached inside and pulled out a coin. Silver, tarnished. One side bore a vulture's talon. The other, a single letter, V. He turned it over once, twice, then set it down beside his badge. Outside, the wind howled across the dry earth, kicking up old bones and broken truths. The sun sank behind the mesa, spilling blood-colored light across the rooftops. And in the silence that followed, you could almost hear the earth hold its breath. They moved through Ashridge like wolves in heat, bold, loud, and slow, their boots pounding a rhythm that didn't match the heartbeat of the town. 6 of them, ragged and sun-scorched, trailing the stink of blood and smoke. Their spurs clinked on the boards like distant thunder, the kind that doesn't bring rain, only fire. At their head rode Clay Marlowe, and the dust itself seemed to part for him. He was broad in the shoulders, but not bulky, all coiled wire and tension, with a sniper's stillness and the patience of a man who had learned to kill from far away, then decided he liked it up close. His gray coat still bore the tattered sleeve insignia of a Confederate sharpshooter, patched over with a hand-stitched vulture in black thread. He'd killed men for less than staring. Killed them slow, too. The Vultures weren't just a gang. They were legend in the territories, ghosts of war turned bandits. Places they'd passed through didn't forget. Hollow Creek, Redwater Junction, a mining camp called Wren's Hollow that no longer existed. Clay Marlowe didn't just rob banks. He gutted the soul of a town, and then he lit the bones on fire. Ashridge was next. But Clay wanted more than gold this time. He wanted to break something quiet, to shatter the myth of a boy with a badge who didn't flinch. He'd heard whispers in saloons and cards' houses, in the mouths of dying men. Whispers of a young lawman with ghost eyes and a legend's shadow hanging over his back like a loaded rifle. Clay hated ghosts. He made them. They hit the town in the morning, and by sundown had their boots on every porch, lounging on barrels, leaning in doorways, flicking knives into fence posts, watching, laughing. They harassed the butcher's wife, let their horses drink from the trough meant for children, spit on the chapel step, and always they looked toward the sheriff's office. Elias didn't come out. He watched from the shaded window, arms crossed, eyes calm. No twitch in the jaw. No hand on the gun that wasn't there. Just silence, as if he were measuring something unseen. It gnawed at them. Clay strutted into the saloon and drank from a bottle he didn't pay for. He carved his name into the bar with a Bowie knife, then told the pianist to play something that bled. When the keys hesitated, he broke a tooth off the man's hand and asked again. Still, Elias did nothing. The town began to murmur. At the feed store, Mrs. Garner shook her head and said, "He's not going to save us." At the church, Father Doolin wiped sweat from his brow and muttered, "God helps those who help themselves." And at the dry mare, Boone Raddock spit into the sawdust and whispered, "He's waiting for something. I just hope to God it ain't too late." On the 3rd day, Clay made his move. He found old Tom Wickers, the blacksmith, heating horseshoes at the edge of town. Tom was gray and half-limp, with hands like bricks and a back bent from decades under anvil and hammer. He'd once chased bandits from his forge with a red-hot poker, but time had worn him down, and Clay Marlowe saw weakness like a buzzard sees meat. No one knew what excuse Clay gave, maybe none. Maybe he just wanted to hear someone beg. They found Tom crumpled in the dirt, face pulped and fingers shattered. The coals of his forge were still warm, his blood fresher. No one saw it happen. No one dared step in. Elias arrived minutes after. He knelt beside the broken man and placed 2 fingers to his throat. Still breathing. Barely. Then he lifted Tom in his arms like a sack of flour and carried him across the square. People watched from windows, from behind curtains, from behind fear. He didn't say a word. At the doctor's house, he stayed until Tom was stable. Then he walked home under a bruised sky, wind tugging at his coat like a warning. The sheriff's office was dark and still. A single oil lamp flickered against the window pane, dancing shadows across the floorboards. Elias moved to the corner where a small chest sat under his cot, half buried beneath a folded tarp. He stared at it for a long while, fingers grazing the lid, but not opening it. Dust coated the edges. The lock was old, the key already in his palm. He turned it. Inside lay a gun belt, black leather, hand-stitched with faded silver etchings along the edge. It wasn't fancy, but it was worn in a way that spoke of use, not show. Nestled beside it was the revolver, a Colt with a custom barrel, long and slender, ivory grip cracked like dry earth. The initials SV burned into the underside of the holster. Underneath the gun lay the coin, the same coin he'd carried since boyhood. Silver. One side a Vulture's talon, the other just a letter. He picked it up and let it sit in his palm. Memory flickered, like firelight off canyon walls. A boy, no more than 10, crouched in the dirt beside a lean man with a face carved from pain and patience. They were camped beneath the edge of a bluff. The wind hard, the stars harder. Still your breath, the man whispered, voice like gravel. The gun's not your weapon. Time is. You kill with waiting. You kill with silence. The boy nodded, but his hands trembled. The man reached down and placed a coin in his palm. This'll be the last thing they see if they make you draw. Back in the present, Elias slid the belt over his hips. He fastened it slow, the ritual of it like old scripture. The revolver fit his hand like it had grown there. He spun the cylinder once, felt the weight. Familiar. Final. Outside, the town lay wrapped in a quiet more dangerous than any sound. Somewhere Clay Marlowe was smiling, but inside the sheriff's office, a ghost had come awake. The screams had rung like bells through the cotton fields. Elias remembered the fire first, how it bloomed behind his eyelids even when they were closed. The house had gone up fast, too fast for a 10-year-old boy to understand what was happening. His mother's voice, shrill and cracking, called his name as boots pounded the porch, as men shouted for silver and whiskey and names Elias didn't know. His father had grabbed the hunting rifle, but the door burst open before he could chamber around. The last thing Elias saw before he slipped through the back window was a gloved hand yanking his mother's hair back, steel flashing in the light. He ran for 2 days. No food, no shoes, just blood crusted to his legs and his brother's lucky coin clenched in his fist. The plains stretched endless and cruel, every hill a question of survival. He collapsed near a canyon rim under a merciless sun, ready to let the vultures take him. But the vultures didn't come. A man did. Boots scuffed the rock, slow and deliberate, as a shadow knelt beside him. When Elias blinked up through the blur of tears and heat, he saw a face carved in hard lines, skin like cracked leather, stubble gray with dust, eyes like 2 black nails hammered into a coffin lid. The man didn't speak at first. He just tipped a canteen to the boy's lips and watched him drink like a starving dog. Later, around a small fire lit low in a narrow crevice of the canyon, the man spoke. "Name's Silas Vane," he said, turning a tin of beans slowly in the flame. "Folks used to call me the Vulture Killer. Don't know what they call me now." Elias didn't answer. Couldn't. Silas handed him the coin he dropped while sleeping. "That yours?" Elias nodded. "You hold on to it," Silas muttered. "A man's got to have one thing he won't lose, even when he's bleeding." So began the apprenticeship no one knew about. Hidden in the canyons and forgotten corners of Texas and New Mexico, Elias learned how to survive. Not just with a gun, but with silence. Silas didn't teach him to shoot until the boy could sit still for a full hour without blinking at the wind. "Gun's the last word," he'd say. "Every time you draw it, it better be scripture." Silas taught him to listen to footsteps before voices, to watch how a man reached for his drink, to see what fear looked like hiding behind anger. Patience was the weapon, not speed. Delay. Disarm. Understand. Then, if there was no other way, draw and don't miss. He showed Elias how to clean a Colt with eyes closed, how to judge distance by wind on the cheek, how to shoot in silence. He taught him how not to hate, even when revenge itched under the ribs like a wound. And one night, when Elias asked him why he did it, why he'd saved a dying boy from the desert, Silas only said, "Because someone saved me once, and because this world's made of fire and ghosts. One's always trying to burn you, the other's always trying to remind you who you are." Years passed. The boy became a shadow. When Silas fell to fever in the cave mouth of El Cielo Ridge, Elias buried him beneath stone and thorn and carved no name, just a vulture's talon in the rock. Then he walked east, with the coin in his pocket and no destination. Now, standing alone at the edge of the canyon outside Ashridge, Elias fastened the holster to his thigh and stood with the sunset pouring blood across the sky. The revolver rested in his palm like a secret remembered. He drew, holstered, drew, holstered, over and over, until the movement was no longer movement, only breath and rhythm. The ghosts didn't speak in words. They moved in muscle memory. They lived in the weight of the belt, the feel of grit under boots, the pause before the trigger pulled back. Silas was gone, but the canyon still echoed with him. Back in town, the vultures circled tighter. Clay's men grew bold. They swaggered to the general store and took what they wanted. They made the preacher sing whiskey songs in the street. They overturned the water barrel in front of the schoolhouse. Then, one afternoon, they killed Joshua Lane. He was no fighter, just a cobbler with poor hearing and a stutter. He refused to shine one of their boots. Maybe he didn't hear the threat. Maybe he was just tired of being afraid. Doesn't matter. One of the vultures, Bray, the one with the scar under his eye and the gold tooth, put a bullet through his gut and left him crawling in the dirt outside his own shop. It took him 20 minutes to die. The town gathered in a sick hush, and no one stopped it. No one dared. Elias arrived too late. He stood over the body as the widow wept, her hand knotted in her apron, her mouth open in a silent scream. Blood soaked the road. Clay's men watched from the saloon steps, grinning. Then she turned. The slap cracked louder than the gunshot had. Her palm met Elias' face with a fury born of helplessness, grief, and shame. "You let him die," she screamed, voice raw. "What good is your badge if you won't bleed for us?" Elias didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood with the sting on his cheek and the weight in his eyes. She stormed away, dragging her husband's body with her. That night, Ashridge seemed smaller. Even the wind hesitated. Doors stayed bolted. Lamps stayed dimmed. And the vultures grew louder. But at midnight, one of them disappeared. Wade Holla McCrae, broad, cruel, the one who laughed the most. They found his horse riderless at dawn, tied neatly to the hitching post outside the saloon. No blood, no sound, just the silver coin left on the saddle, catching the morning light. Clay picked it up with 2 fingers. He turned it slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes colder than they'd ever been. No one spoke, because now they understood. The boy hadn't been ignoring them. He'd been waiting. By the time the second man vanished, the vultures had stopped laughing. His name was Keeley, tall, wild-haired, with a temper that flared like dry pine. He'd wandered off before sunrise to stretch his legs, they said. What they found instead was his horse pacing alone near the town's north edge, reins tangled in sagebrush, foam crusted at the mouth. Its throat had been slit with surgical precision. No blood trail, no boot prints in the dirt, just silence and heat and the thick smell of iron. Clay stared at the carcass a long time. Maybe he ran. Dawes muttered behind him, voice low. Clay spat into the dust. Keeley don't run. That night, the gang rode into Ashridge 2x2, eyes peeled. Their laughter now was forced, brittle. Every creaking door, every shifting curtain, felt like a rifle waiting to breathe. They barked orders louder, kicked open crates without reason, picked fights with men who wouldn't meet their gaze. But none of it felt like control. It felt like fear. Elias had become a ghost again, neither seen nor heard, yet pressing in around them like heat under a wool coat. They'd underestimated him, thought he was just some quiet boy clinging to a badge. But something darker was at work. Clay could feel it. Dawes could feel it. Even the horses seemed to. They found tripwires strung across alleyways. Salt poured into water barrels. A fence post removed here, a shutter unhinged there. Subtle things, each no more than an inconvenience. But together, they whispered something into the backs of the outlaws' necks. You are being watched. Dawes began sleeping with a shotgun across his lap. He accused one of the others of stealing jerky, then of looking at him wrong. By morning, he and a younger rider had nearly drawn on each other over a deck of mismatched cards. Clay said nothing, but his eyes never left the sheriff's office. He wanted control back, needed it. But the town had changed. Children no longer cried in the open. Women moved like shadows. And the men, those who had once mocked the badge, now kept glancing to the corners of roofs, the mouths of alleyways. The weight of silence was no longer fear alone. It carried hope now, and that made it dangerous. When the stray bullet hit the boy, everything stopped. He couldn't have been more than 8, playing near the general store, chasing a hoop down the dusty path. One of Clay's men, angry and twitching, had fired a warning shot at a dog that barked too loud. The bullet skipped, ricocheted, and found the boy's side. He dropped wordlessly, face first into the dirt. Screams broke the stillness. A woman, his mother, rushed out, skirts flailing, wailing his name. Clay's men stood stunned. The shooter stammered, backing away. Then Elias was there. No one saw where he came from. One moment there was chaos. The next he was kneeling beside the child, hand steady, voice calm. "Stay with me," he whispered, pressing cloth to the wound. "Breathe through it. That's it." The boy's eyes fluttered. He gasped, then gripped Elias's hand. The outlaw who fired stepped forward, mouth open with a clumsy apology. Elias didn't look at him. "Go ahead," he said quietly, not to the boy, not to the mother, but to the gang. "Give me another excuse." Something in his tone turned their blood cold. The man stepped back. No one followed. Elias lifted the child gently, cradling him close as he walked to the doctor's house. The entire town watched, breath held. Not a single vulture dared move. The next day, Clay snapped. He rode to the center of town with 4 men behind him, guns displayed, faces pale beneath the desert sun. He called out so everyone could hear. "This ends now," he barked. "Sheriff, you want to play ghost, fine. But come sundown, if you don't meet me face to face, this whole town burns. I'll leave the church smoldering and let the crows fight over your schoolhouse." Then he turned his horse and rode toward the saloon, where he poured himself a drink with a hand that finally trembled. Sundown came like a blade, long, slow, and sharp. Inside the saloon, Clay sat at the bar, jaw tight, finger tapping in nervous rhythm. Dawes stood behind him, chewing the inside of his cheek, eyes scanning every shadow. The place was near empty. No piano music, no laughter, just the smell of sweat and whiskey and the weight of things not said. Then the door opened. Elias Kane walked in. No gun, no badge, just a cup of coffee in one hand, steam curling into the dim air. His coat was dusty, his shirt unbuttoned at the throat. He moved like he wasn't entering danger, but returning to it. He didn't speak, just walked slowly to the bar and sat down next to Clay, like they were old friends due for a quiet drink. The bartender, pale and shaking, disappeared into the back. The silence was unbearable. "You got some goddamn gall," Clay finally muttered, voice raw. Elias took a sip of coffee. "You've killed 2 of mine," Clay said. Elias didn't look at him. 3. Dawes flinched. "You're playing games, boy," Clay hissed, leaning closer. "This ain't war. It's a noose you're threading, and it's around your own neck." Elias set the cup down. Slowly, quietly, from his coat pocket, he pulled a small silver coin and placed it on the bar between them, one side up. The talon gleamed in the low light. Clay stared at it. The silence swelled like thunder behind glass. His face hardened. "No," he breathed. Elias stood. Clay rose with him, one hand reaching instinctively for his gun, though he didn't draw. "Couldn't. Silas Vane," he said, voice cracked with memory. "You were his boy." Elias turned his eyes to him now, eyes calm, old, untouched by fear. "I was," he said, and then he walked out. Clay stood there long after the door closed behind him, hand frozen near his holster, staring at the coin. Behind him, Dawes whispered, "What do we do?" Clay didn't answer, because for the first time since they'd ridden into Ashridge, he didn't know. The sun sank low, dragging long shadows over Ashridge like the hem of a black veil. Clouds bled orange and rust, the sky thick with silence that wasn't peace, but breath held before a scream. Doors were bolted, curtains drawn, the streets emptied. A dry wind slipped through the alleys, carrying dust and dread. Inside the old chapel, Elias stood before a map of the town laid out on the communion table. His finger hovered over alleyways, choke points, blind corners. Around him, men who once called him soft now stood armed, listening like students before a final exam. "You see movement," Elias said, voice low, steady. "You don't fire right away. Let him step twice. First step's confidence. Second one's the mistake." The preacher, rifle slung awkwardly across his chest, nodded with trembling hands. Beside him, the widow whose husband had been gunned down now stood with a lantern and a pistol. The schoolteacher, the blacksmith's apprentice, the barkeep, they all had places. None were soldiers, but they had heart. Elias needed that more than bullets. He looked up once more at the dying light outside. "They'll come when the sun touches the ridge," he said. "They think dusk hides them." He turned, pulling his coat over the hand-stitched gun belt. The silver coin still sat in his pocket. A whisper of Silas. "They don't know," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "That dusk is when ghosts walk." The ridge darkened. Clay Marlowe and the 4 remaining vultures rode in slow. Their horses moved like wolves scenting blood. Clay wore no hat now, just wild eyes, sunburnt skin, and a long gray coat that flapped like torn wings behind him. Dawes rode at his side, his rifle already cocked. They came in 2 groups, 2 flanking left, 2 right, Clay and Dawes up the middle. Fire and fear in their eyes. Confidence still. They had numbers, training, and cruelty. But Elias had ghosts. The first shot rang out from the church belfry. One of the left flank riders crumpled backward off his horse, his head snapping like a marionette's. The bell above him groaned but didn't ring. The second rider veered toward the saloon, only to be met by a burst of shotgun fire from beneath the porch. The schoolteacher, pale and shaking, worked the pump and fired again, tears streaking his cheeks. The rider dropped, limbs twitching. Panic bloomed. Dawes barked commands. The other flank charged forward, but the alley beside the old tailor's shop erupted with smoke and flame. Elias had laid oil traps, just like Silas taught him. Screams echoed. A horse bolted. Clay pressed forward, eyes scanning, and Elias emerged. From behind the well, he moved like a whisper, calm, unreadable, precise. 2 shots, crack, crack, and Dawes staggered back, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. He fell to his knees, gasping, eyes locked on Elias, with a mixture of awe and hate. Clay dismounted, crouched low. His revolver gleamed. He shouted something, but it was lost in the gunfire. The widow took down another vulture from the post office window. A clean shot. No joy in her face, only quiet fury. Soon it was Clay alone. Ashridge burned with noise and smoke, but the streets were empty again. The people watched from shadows, waiting. Clay walked to the center of town. Elias stepped out to meet him. They stood not 20 paces apart. 2 figures, mirrored in shadow and dust. "You're bleeding," Clay growled. Elias glanced at his arm, where grays had torn fabric and skin. He didn't reply. Clay's fingers flexed on his revolver. "You think you're justice? That you're different than me?" "I didn't burn farms for gold," Elias said. "Didn't shoot children." "Neither did I." Clay snapped, "Too fast. I shoot weakness. What gets in the way?" "You just described yourself." Clay snarled, and the air shattered. His shot hit center mass. Elias stumbled back, breath catching in his throat. Blood soaked his shirt. The townsfolk cried out. Clay took a step forward, gun still raised, victorious. And Elias raised his left hand. Small, silver, and deadly. He fired the hidden derringer tucked beneath his sleeve. Clay froze. His revolver slipped from his hand like a forgotten word. He staggered once, then dropped to his knees. A red bloom spread across his chest like rust on linen. He stared up at Elias in disbelief. "You! Silas's trick!" he wheezed. Elias stood, swaying slightly, a hand pressed to his wound. "He taught me everything," he whispered. "Even how to bait a vulture." Clay's mouth opened again, but no words came. Just blood. He toppled face first into the dust. Silence returned. It was a full minute before anyone moved. Then the townsfolk emerged slowly, as if stepping from a dream. They gathered around Elias, who remained standing by Will alone. The widow approached, eyes shining. "You all right?" she asked softly. Elias gave a faint nod. "Good," she said, and for the first time she smiled. Above them, the wind shifted, and the first stars began to show. The dust settled slowly over Clay Marlowe's body, as if the town itself had exhaled. And in that breath, Elias Kane, quiet, strange, forged in shadow, stood tall, bleeding, but unbroken. The ghost had kept his promise. Ashridge woke to stillness, the kind that doesn't bring peace, only the long, aching echo of what had been broken. Smoke clung to the eaves. Bullet holes scarred shutters and doors. Blood had dried on the dust, black now in the early light, like ink spilled over a forgotten chapter. No one cheered. There were no parades. Just silence. The townsfolk came out in cautious steps. The preacher knelt beside Dawes's body, murmuring a prayer too quiet for God to hear. The schoolteacher sat on the chapel steps, his hands shaking as he cleaned his borrowed shotgun. The widow stood in the middle of Main Street, staring at the place where her husband had fallen days earlier, and where the man who killed him now lay face down in the dirt, unmourned. The wind had shifted. The air smelled different. Clean, but not sweet. By the sheriff's office, the door swung open with a creak. Elias stepped out, slow and stiff, a strip of bloodied cloth tied tight across his ribs. His coat hung heavier than before, soaked through in places, torn in others. He paused to watch the sky for a moment, pale blue, cloudless, and then walked out into the morning. He passed the general store, where the window had been shattered, past the jailhouse with the broken lock, past the saloon, now quiet as a mausoleum. A few people looked at him as he went, eyes full of questions they didn't ask. No one tried to stop him. He moved toward the chapel. The preacher met him at the steps, wordless. Elias reached into his coat, pulled out the silver star, dulled and scratched now. He placed it in the preacher's open hand. The preacher looked down at it. When he looked back up, Elias was already walking again. He went alone through the canyon pass, where the earth rose like giant ribs on either side. His pace was steady, as though the wound were nothing, as though the desert knew not to touch him. They say he didn't leave tracks. The dust closed behind him like he was never there. They say the boy sheriff was raised by ghosts, that his blood ran with gunpowder and justice, that he never smiled, never wept, that the desert carved him from silence, then set him loose like a bullet without a gun. No one saw him ride out, or if he rode at all. Just gone, like fog burned off by the sun. But the town remembered. Every time the wind moaned through Ashridge, rattling old windows and sweeping the grit through narrow alleys, folks would pause. Some would smile faintly. Others would bow their heads. Children learned not to shout too loud in the streets. The quiet was sacred now. Years later, the story still hung heavy in the canyon air. A boy, no older than Elias had been when he first came to Ashridge, ran chasing a lizard over the rocks beyond the ridge. He stumbled near the bend, fell hard into the sand, and when he pushed himself up, he saw something glinting under his palm. A coin, worn thin, dull with age, but stitched with a symbol he didn't recognize, an old vulture's wing etched faintly on the surface. He picked it up, brushing the dust from its face, and stared out at the canyon beyond. The wind stirred. It whispered down the rock, low and slow and knowing. The boy listened, coin clenched in his fist, and for just a breath, he thought he heard spurs in the distance. A single echo, like a name spoken by the desert itself. Then it was gone, but he held the coin tighter, and behind him, the wind carried the name Elias Kane.